Well, shalom, my name is Todd Bennett, and today I'd like to talk a little bit about the observance and celebration of Purim. Many who discover and start walking out the Hebraic roots of their faith typically learn about the 7 annual appointed times described in the Torah, namely Passover, followed by unleavened bread, Shavuot, Yom Teruah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and then culminating on Shemini Atzeret, the 8th day. Now, as they progress through this annual cycle, they often come across other Jewish holidays that they really don't know what to do with because they're not found in the Torah. Although there are references to these historical events that we can read about in the scriptures. 2 of them specifically are Hanukkah and Purim. I've already dealt with Hanukkah and other video teachings, and I thought it would be appropriate to deal with Purim on this video. Now, neither Hanukkah nor Purim are designated as Moedim, appointed times of Yahuwah, and we're not commanded to keep either of them according to the Torah. Both are very interesting historical events, though, involving the house of Judah that occurred after the end of their Babylonian exile and prior to the appearance of Yeshua HaMashiach. Both are celebrations commemorating victories that the Yahudim experienced over their enemies. Purim is described in the scroll of Esther, and Hanukkah is described in Maccabees. The story of Esther is contained in a scroll often referred to as the Megillah. And the Megillah of Esther describes events that occurred in Persia around 483 BCE to 473 BCE, while Maccabees describes events in Jerusalem and the land of Judah much later, around 168 BCE. So the Purim events took place well before the Hanukkah events, and it might help some to place Esther in its proper historical context before we discuss the actual story found in the Megillah. So here's just a little bit of history. After the death of King Solomon, the kingdom of Israel was divided into 2 houses around 930 BCE. The northern tribes, called the House of Israel, fell away from the covenant and were conquered and taken captive by the Assyrians around 722 BCE, nearly 200 years after the kingdom was divided. The House of Judah, the southern tribes, followed suit. They also fell away from the covenant, and they were completely conquered by Nebuchadnezzar after various exiles. And Jerusalem and the temple were both destroyed around 586 BCE. Now, according to Jeremiah, Babylon would be punished after 70 years, and Judah would also be allowed to return after a 70-year exile. Although these 2 70-year periods were concurrent, they were not keyed to the same start and end dates. And now some confuse these 2 70-year periods as being the same, which is not the case. In fact, during the 70-year punishment over Judah, we read about the culmination of the 70-year punishment of Babylon when they were conquered by the Medo-Persians in one night. Now, Daniel was one of the Yahudim who was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, and the book of Daniel actually takes place entirely during his captivity in Babylon and then subsequently Persia. In Daniel 5, we read about the incident where the Medo-Persians conquered the Babylonians in one night, and we read that in Daniel 5:30 through 31. It says, that very night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, when we read Daniel and examine his life, we realize that he was keeping track of time. Even though he was in exile, he knew there were limitations to the judgments, and he was keeping track and wanted to find out when they were done, because I'm sure he wanted to go home. He witnessed the 70-year period expire for the Babylonian punishment, and he wanted to know when the 70-year exile of Yehuda was going to end. Again, he wanted to go home. He didn't want to remain in exile. In Daniel 9, we read about Daniel actually praying concerning the 70-year period of judgment over Yehuda. And it's starting at 1, he says, in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, by descent a Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the scrolls the number of years that according to the word of Yahuwah to Jeremiah the prophet must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So Daniel wanted an answer. So what did he do? According to Daniel 9:3, then I turned my face to Yahuwah Elohim, seeking him by prayer and pleas for mercy with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. So he prayed, he pled for mercy, he fasted, and he humbled himself in sackcloth and ashes, looking for an answer to his question regarding the end of the punishment. Now this stands in stark contrast to what we'll later read in Esther. And as a result of his actions, he received a visit from the messenger Gabriel, who told him about 70 weeks. So while he was praying about 70 years, he received an answer to prayer involving 70 weeks. And those 70 weeks were divided into 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and 1 week, leading up to the restoration of Jerusalem and the Messiah, followed by him being cut off and the destruction of the city and the sanctuary. It was good news followed by bad news, along with an incredible promise of the Messiah confirming, or rather strengthening, the covenant. So those 70 weeks would begin from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem. The trigger event was a decree to restore and build Jerusalem. Now, we read about various decrees in the scriptures, and in Ezra 1, 2 through 3, we read that Cyrus issued a decree to rebuild the house of Yahuwah, the temple. And it reads, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of Yahuwah by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, Yahuwah stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, Yahuwah the Elohim of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he's charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his Elohim be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of Yahuwah, the Elohim of Israel. He is the Elohim who is in Jerusalem. And let each survivor, in whatever place he sojourns, be assisted by the men of his place, with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides freewill offerings for the house of Elohim that is in Jerusalem. So in 538 BCE, Cyrus allowed the Yahudim to return to the covenant land and rebuild the temple, but that did not trigger the 70-week prophecy. In fact, we know that while some of the Yahudim who were exiled to Babylon returned to the land, most actually remained in exile. They were comfortable and probably didn't want to uproot the lives that they had built while they were in exile. It was clearly dangerous and a difficult journey back to the covenant land, and most had never even seen the land before because they were too young to even remember it. So their homes, as far as they were concerned, were in Babylon, in Persia, and that's where many just decided to stay. And that's very interesting because those of us in modern and prosperous Western cultures should really take heed of this potential issue of falling into a comfort zone to such an extent that we can't even move when the Spirit of Yah prompts us and when He opens the door for us to be delivered, redeemed, and brought back to His land. You know, the scriptures remind us to come out of her, my people, in Revelation 18:4, and that's referring to Babylon the Great. And sadly, most are unable or unwilling to detach from the culture that they've been raised in, and actually leaving Babylon with all its comforts and amenities is a very difficult thing for people to do. So the lost sheep of the house of Israel, who are currently exiled throughout much of the world and currently mixed in with this Babylonian system, are in a very similar position as those from the house of Yehuda who were taken captive and brought to Babylon. The primary difference is that our exile has been longer than that of the Yahudim, although we're on the cusp of our punishment actually expiring if we understand Ezekiel 4 and the punishment that was rendered over the house of Israel multiplied by 7 times. So we can learn from history and try to be ready when the time comes for us to be fully restored into the covenant and the covenant land. And our hope is that when we hear the cry that the bridegroom is coming, that we're awake with oil in our lamps, as Messiah gave a parable of the 10 virgins, 5 wise and 5 foolish in Matthew 25. We want to be the wise ones. We want to be the ones that are ready to heed the call and to move out when it's time to go. Sadly, only a remnant actually returned to the land to rebuild the temple after the decree from Cyrus. And we read about the efforts of Zerubbabel and Joshua, the high priest, through the prophets of Zechariah and Haggai. It was a slow and difficult start, fraught with many problems and delays. Restoration is not always easy, and it requires faith, hard work, and diligence to avoid being discouraged and giving up. Now, we know from historical records that after the decree of Cyrus in 538 BCE, there were 3 subsequent decrees that followed. Around 520 BCE, Darius issued a decree that confirmed the earlier decree of Cyrus, and that resulted in the temple eventually being built and dedicated around 515 BCE. Now, Jerusalem remained in disrepair, and around 458 BCE, Artaxerxes I issued a decree to Ezra, and later, around 445 BCE, Artaxerxes I issued another decree to Nehemiah. Turns out that the decree given to Ezra by Artaxerxes in 458 BCE was likely the trigger event for the 70 weeks, and the subsequent decree given to Nehemiah only confirmed and strengthened the previous decree given to Ezra. So in the midst of all these decrees, a period that spanned around 80 years, we see a very slow return and rebuilding process after the punishment of Judah had expired. And it's within this time frame that the story of Esther occurs, during the reign of Xerxes I, who ruled between Darius I and Artaxerxes I. Now, Xerxes I was a Persian king of the Achaemenid dynasty who reigned from 485 BCE to 465 BCE, a span of 20 years. In the scriptures, he's known as Ahasuerus, and he was actually the son of Darius and the father of Artaxerxes I. So his reign is couched in between the decrees we've been talking about. And while the Yahudim were struggling to return and rebuild during this period of time, the Persian Empire was also struggling to maintain its strength. Darius, the father of Xerxes I, had been humiliated by the Greeks at the Battle of Marathon. So his son Xerxes, who succeeded him, was occupied with putting down rebellions in Babylon and Egypt, all the while planning another invasion of Greece to restore his father's honor and reassert the power of the Persian Empire. The story of Esther begins with Xerxes I, again referred to as Ahasuerus, who was struggling to maintain order and honor in a period of upheaval. It describes a huge drinking festival that he threw for 180 days at his palace in Shushan. He was hosting all the princes and nobles of the provinces, described as the power of Persia and Media. The event was meant to consolidate his power and probably motivate his princes and nobles for the planned future invasion of Greece. It was filled with debauchery and lasciviousness, and by decree, no one was responsible for their actions. So during this drunk fest, anybody could do whatever they wanted, and they wouldn't get in trouble for it. And the king also stepped in it during this period of time because he actually was going to try to force his wife, Queen Vashti, to come and kind of parade in front of all the nobles and princes, and she refused. She was off celebrating with the women. The men were celebrating separately, and he called upon her, and she refused to come. So in a rage, he essentially divorced her because he felt that she had disrespected him in front of all the rulers and nobles who he was trying to actually put on a good face in front of. So again, the festivals likely was to impress his nobles and shore up their support for a major military campaign, and if he's being disrespected by his wife in front of them, it doesn't bode well for a future attack on Greece. So after vanquishing Vashti, his advisors hatched a plan to find him a new queen from the virgins in his kingdom. Now, we know from historical records that at this point in time, that's when he launched what is known as the Second Persian invasion of Greece. He was soundly defeated by an alliance of Athenians and Spartans through a series of battles. One of the famous battles of that campaign was the Battle of Thermopylae, where the Spartan king Leonidas I, along with 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians and possibly another 1,300 support troops, held back the Persian army, which some estimated at 1 million soldiers. They were coming at the Spartans and the Thespians in waves of 10,000 at a time, and they held them off for a period of 3 days. And that stand of the Spartans at Thermopylae under Leonidas was what inspired the 2006 movie titled 300. It was quite a historic battle. That was probably one of the motivating forces for the Greek alliance to actually defeat the Persians, and it must have been pretty disheartening for the Persian army to not have just been able to mow over those a few troops. So anyways, after receiving a thorough beating from the Greeks, Xerxes returned to Shushan in defeat and humiliation. And it's during the remaining reign of this beaten down and weakened king that we find the context of the rest of the story of Esther beginning in chapter 2. So in chapter 2, the story picks up telling about the procedure being implemented for the queen selection process, and it appears that the king was now preoccupied with finding a new queen who could comfort him, maybe help him lick his wounds after he was beat up by the Greeks. The story describes a certain woman named Hadassah, and she was one of the exiles of Judah from the tribe of Benjamin. Hadassah was an orphan, and her Hebrew name means myrtle. Now, her parents were dead, and she was raised by Mordecai, her first cousin. Now, as a result of the king's decree to find a wife, she was taken to the palace of the king and prepared with the other virgins, and Mordecai instructed her not to reveal her heritage at that time. So nobody knew that she was one of the Yahudim. Now, that may be the reason why she assumed the name of Esther, which derives from Ishtar and Easter, the Babylonian fertility goddess. The name was apropos for the competition that she found herself in, which was all about sexually pleasing the king. Now, Esther was apparently very beautiful and had favor with everyone she encountered, and ultimately she did in fact become the queen. And while she was queen, a man called Haman the Agagite rose to power in the kingdom. Mordecai wouldn't bow to him, so Haman plotted to wipe out Mordecai and all of his kin, the Yahudim. Haman knew that Mordecai was of the Yahudim, and he went to Xerxes and asked the king to destroy a certain people whose laws were in conflict with his kingdom, although he did not specifically identify the people as the Yahudim. And without any inquiry, the king gave his consent. He seemed disinterested in the affairs of his kingdom and was more than willing to hand off his power and responsibility to Haman. And this appears to be the result of, again, his weakened condition and the losses that he experienced. He was withdrawn in the palace and lost touch with his kingdom because he was losing support. And as it turns out, Mordecai actually thwarted an assassination attempt against his life. Now, once Haman received the consent of the king to destroy the people, he had the green light to enact his revenge against Mordecai and annihilate the Yahudim in Persia. He just needed to determine the right time. Now, interestingly, we can discern that Haman was an Amalekite because he came from the line of Agag, and Agag was the king of the Amalekites, according to 1 Samuel 15. Now, remember, Saul failed to kill Agag and all of the Amalekites as commanded. That's the reason why the kingdom was taken from Saul in the first place and given to David. So Haman was actually alive and empowered to kill the Yahudim because of the sin of the first king of Israel. Now remember that Saul, as with Mordecai and Esther, was also from the tribe of Benjamin. So Saul failed to wipe out the Amalekites, and now the Amalekites were on the verge of wiping out his tribe of Benjamin and all of Judah for that matter. And it's no coincidence that Saul's descendants from the tribe of Benjamin were forced to deal with the after effects of his sin. And it would take a queen to undo and correct the results and the failings of the first king of Israel. And that's just a reminder of the need to diligently obey the commandments and the potential far-reaching consequences of our failure to do so. Now, according to Esther 3:7, prior to seeking permission from the king, Haman cast lots to determine the best day to exterminate the Yahudim. The lots fell on the 13th day of the 12th month. Now, Purim is the Persian word for lots, and that's why this time is referred to as Purim, as the fate of the Yahudim was determined by lots. And the text then records that the king gave Haman his ring, and the decree to destroy the Yahudim was written and sealed on the 13th day of the first month. So the decree was to take effect 11 months later. Now, the dates are pretty significant because this decree was issued only hours before the Yahudim were supposed to be celebrating Passover after sunset. And here's where it really helps to understand the historical context. You see, the decree given to Haman to destroy the Yahudim was issued around 474 BCE. The Yahudim had previously been allowed to return to the covenant land in 538 BCE, over 60 years prior to Haman's decree. The temple had been completed and dedicated around 515 BCE, 40 years prior to this decree issued by the king according to the request of Haman. So there was an active and functioning temple in Jerusalem, and the Yahudim were permitted to return home. So why were these people still in Persia? Why hadn't they returned to the covenant land? Why weren't they in Jerusalem following the Torah? In fact, why weren't they in Jerusalem celebrating Passover? The message, it seems, was loud and clear on the timing of all this. This decree was issued immediately prior to Passover. Now, if they were observing the rehearsal of Passover, according to the Torah, they likely would have gotten the message. In fact, that evening, they were supposed to be remembering the Exodus from Egypt. The Torah provides in Exodus 12:1, "In this manner you shall eat it. With your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, you shall eat it in haste. It is Yahweh's Passover." So when you're in Jerusalem observing the Passover, you can recline, as Yeshua and his disciples did at the Last Supper, because you're at your final destination in Jerusalem. If you're in the covenant and find yourself anywhere else, that should mean that you're in exile. And you should be rehearsing and anticipating a return when you go through the Passover Seder. You should be anxious to go home to the covenant land and praying for a return, as we saw Daniel doing, and we should be ready to leave as the commandment instructs us. The fact that they weren't in Jerusalem celebrating the Passover reveals that they weren't really following the Torah wholeheartedly. And unlike the Exodus from Egypt, the Yahudim were really without a strong leader. Well, Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, led the first captives back to the land. Apparently not many were willing to follow him at that time. And as a result, the Yahudim remained fractured and divided, and the people were not in one accord. They actually had 11 months to leave, but what was their response? We read about it in Esther 4:3. "And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Yahudim, and fasting, and weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes." Now, it sounds close to what Daniel did, but there are some stark contrasts between the two. If we look back at Daniel, it's worth reviewing everything that went on in his prayer. In Daniel 9:3-7, we read, "Then I set my face toward Yahuwah Elohi to make request by prayer and supplications with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. And I prayed to Yahuwah my Elohi and made confession and said, O Adonai, great and awesome, who keeps his covenant and mercy with those who love him and with those who keep his commandments. We've sinned and committed iniquity. We've done wickedly and rebelled, even by departing from your precepts and your judgments. Neither have we heeded your servants, the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings and our princes, to our fathers and all the people of the land. O Adonai, righteousness belongs to you, but to us shame of face, as it is this day. To the men of Judah, to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and all Israel, those near and those far off, in all the countries to which you've driven them, because of the unfaithfulness which they've committed against you. Now, it's really quite a contrast. Notice that Daniel emphasizes those who love Yahuwah and keep his commandments. Messiah Yeshua specifically stated, if you love me, keep my commandments. And this is how we express our love to Yahuwah, not only in words, but also through our deeds, our obedience. Now, Daniel was confessing his sins and the sins of his people and all Israel. He was also very clear who he was praying to, Yahuwah, his Elohi. That emphasized the covenant relationship he had with his Adonai, and he specifically referred to the covenant, the one that called for a temple in Jerusalem and for the covenant people to meet there with their Elohim. Daniel wanted to get things restored so the covenant people could get back to the fullness of the covenant within the covenant land. And sadly, it appears that was not the priority of the ones who stayed in Persia. Those people wanted to stay put. They just didn't want to be exterminated in 11 months. Now, while Daniel prayed to Yahuwah, confessed, repented, and pled for mercy, there's no mention of the Yahudim specifically repenting. Again, they were mourning and distraught because their lives were in danger there in Persia, not because they wanted to return to the covenant land. Also, it's interesting to note that when Esther called for a 3-day fast, there was no mention of confession, repentance, or prayer, or even the name of Yahuwah. In fact, the fast was for her. In Esther 4:50-16, we read, Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer, Go gather together all the Yahudim that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me. Now, very interestingly, you won't find the name of Yahuwah in the scroll of Esther, nor is there even any mention to Elohim in that scroll. Now, there's some debate on whether the scroll of Esther that everybody uses is a complete scroll. The standard Megillah contains 10 chapters, and the 10th is very short. There are some that allege there is an additional portion of Esther which basically completes chapter 10 and goes on to chapter 16. There's debate over whether that additional section is a part of the original or not. For the sake of this teaching, we're just going to talk about the scroll that is in common use this day. Now, just be aware, none of the observations that we're making here are intended to minimize the efforts of these people who were under heavy pressure. And they very likely could have prayed, and they very likely could have confessed and repented. But the absence of this information in the scroll seems to be purposeful in order to make a point. And I believe that the missing information is really the hidden message in the Megillah of Esther. It's revealing that something was missing with these Yahudim in Persia. Now, ultimately, Esther developed a plan and exposed the plot of Haman, and his scheming was turned back on himself. And instead of destroying the Yahudim, Haman and all his kin were killed. And in an incredible act of irony, he was hung on the gallows that he had built to execute Mordecai. And the ring that the king had given to Haman was given to Mordecai. And Mordecai was given great honor. Now, the king issued a new decree on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, permitting the Yahudim the right to assemble and defend themselves on day 13 of month 12, and to take the spoil of everyone that they killed. So instead of being a day when they would be victims only, this new decree supplemented the old decree, and it gave them the ability to fight against their enemies on that day. This really took the wind out of Haman's decree and put people in fear of attempting to harm the Yahudim. In fact, the text of Esther actually says that many people converted out of fear of the Yahudim. So on day 13 of month 12, the Yahudim slew their enemies, and they rested the following day. The text actually says that all the rulers of the provinces helped the Yahudim because of the fear of Mordecai. Now, again, visibly absent from the story is the fear of Yahuwah. Also visibly absent is any credit, thanks, or gratitude to Yahuwah. Instead, the story of Esther ends with a complete focus on exalting Mordecai. And we read in Esther 10, 2 through 3, it says, "And all the acts of his power and of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him, are they not written in the scroll of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Yahudi was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Yahudim, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed." Now, in fact, Mordecai is the one who commanded the Yahudim to celebrate Purim on the 14th day and the 15th day of month 12 by feasting and with joy, and of sending portions one to another and gifts to the poor, according to Esther 9:22. So the story of Esther begins with a feast proclaimed by King Xerxes, intending to give him honor, and it ends with a feast proclaimed by Mordecai, which ultimately gave him honor. Now, isn't it interesting that the Yahudim weren't properly observing the specific appointed times of Yahuwah as prescribed in the Torah, yet they actually added another feast to their schedule, which they very likely kept, and they continue to celebrate to this day. That's where the commonly accepted versions of Esther end, although, again, there are texts that claim that they complete 10 through 16. These added chapters actually reveal a more spiritual side to Esther and Mordecai, which is refreshing, but nevertheless, we don't know their origin, and there seems to be a reason why they were left out, if they were even original to begin with. While the traditional story ends on a happy note, though, we know that King Xerxes was later assassinated by the head of the royal bodyguard, and clearly this evidenced the fact that he remained weak and out of touch with his kingdom and in disrepute. Interestingly, despite the fact that he was married to Esther, he issued no decrees to help rebuild Jerusalem or to facilitate the return of the Yahudim to the Promised Land. It wasn't until after the death of Xerxes, when his son Artaxerxes I assumed the throne, that new decrees were issued to Ezra and Nehemiah, as we mentioned previously, and those eventually resulted in the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. Now, it's possible that Esther had some influence in those decrees, as she was likely a contemporary of Ezra and Nehemiah, but one can only wonder why it never happened while she reigned as queen. Ultimately, Esther reigned as queen of Persia for a period of about 13 years. With King Xerxes, she had one son named Darius II, who later succeeded Artaxerxes I. So, while the scroll of Esther contains a powerful story through words that were written, an even more amazing story can be seen from the words that were not written. The story exemplifies the mercy and faithfulness of Yahuwah to a people who were not following him wholeheartedly, and it's a sad commentary of the condition of the house of Yehudah that remained in exile after the 70-year punishment was over and they were permitted to go home. While Daniel was longing to return, seeking the end of the 70-year exile, there were many in Persia who seemed content just to stay where they were at. They wanted to maintain the status quo of their lives in exile. Now, if Mordecai and the Yahudim in Persia had actually returned to rebuild and restore the covenant land when they were first permitted, one can only wonder if the threat of Haman would have ever even happened. No one can say for sure, but It clearly was meant to be a wake-up call that only a remnant actually heeded. The story clearly revealed that the restoration of the house of Yehuda was not complete, although Yahweh continued to make a way and enable those willing to return the opportunity to do so. And it wasn't easy, because the covenant path was never meant to be easy. In fact, Messiah Yeshua stated, because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it. The covenant journey meant to test the faith and the hearts of the people, just like the wilderness after the Exodus from Egypt was a test. And we read about the difficult process of returning and living in the land through Ezra and Nehemiah, and then further along into Maccabees, which actually describes the Hanukkah scenario. Now, sadly, the Yahudim, they lacked a king like David, one who could unite the divided kingdom and shepherd the flock. When that king eventually came, as foretold by Gabriel to Daniel, most of the religious leaders of the Yahudim rejected that king. That resulted in another destruction of the temple and Jerusalem by the Romans, and another exile of the Yahudim. So despite the miracle described in the Purim story, it appears that the Yahudim failed to properly acknowledge and follow Yahweh. They were never fully restored to the covenant. Ultimately, they don't need the efforts of a Persian queen or a second in command. They need a righteous king. And so here we are 2,500 years after the events in the scroll, with most Yahudim still looking at Esther and Mordecai, while completely ignoring the king, and almost everyone is failing to recognize the real lesson contained in the Megillah, the missing words. Both the house of Israel and the house of Yehuda need to get the lesson, because it appears that present conditions and circumstances are not much different from the days of Esther that we read in the Megillah. We saw that there was a resolution from the United Nations in 1947 partitioning the covenant land, which resulted in some Yahudim establishing a Jewish state called Israel. That state was not grounded on a desire to restore the covenant with Yahweh, nor does it recognize the righteous king, Yeshua. Rather, it was founded according to the ideals of a political movement called Zionism. Now, while Zionism sounds like a religious movement, it's really nothing of the sort. And today we see a remnant of the Yahudim back in the land, but even more are scattered all around the world. Again, similar to the days of Esther. So it seems that many are in the same condition as we read about in Esther, content to dwell in Babylon with no real desire to return and destroy. Now, there are some in the land trying to rebuild a physical temple, but their efforts are futile. They continue to ignore the king who came and fulfilled the 70-week prophecy given to Daniel. And most of those currently living in the land are not focused on restoring the covenant at all. The religious are generally following the teachings of the Pharisees, and most of the population in the modern state of Israel is secular and following the ways of Babylon. They're surrounded by enemies, yet they mainly rely on the strength of their intelligence services and their military, not Yahweh Elohim. And again, that was the focus of the deliverance in the story of Esther, the Yahudim banding together to kill their enemies. And as with Esther, the name of Yahweh is rarely ever spoken in Israel due to a tradition in Judaism not to speak the name. So, as a result, the story of Esther can certainly be looked upon as a great miracle, but even more so as a sober reminder of the failure of the house of Yehuda to fully acknowledge, worship, serve, and obey Yahweh, and return to the covenant after their Babylonian exile. It's also a very relevant and important reminder for us not to get too comfortable in our lives while in exile. Otherwise, we can completely miss out on the restoration that will occur when our punishment is over. We need to remember the lessons and heed the warnings and be ready to leave Babylon. Otherwise, we may find ourselves stuck in the shadow of Haman's gallows. So Purim is a wonderful story of the faithfulness of Yahuwah to an unfaithful people. And those of us who follow the King can be thankful that this amazing story is really a celebration of our King and the need for our King, as it was intimately tied to the 70-week prophecy concerning the Messiah. And it thwarted the extinction of the Yahudim, which would have meant that the Messiah would have not been born. So it's a wonderful time to consider and to be thankful for. But only through the Messiah Yeshua did we see the fulfillment of Daniel's 70 weeks and the fulfillment of our bodies as the temple of Yahuwah. And we now wait for his return when he restores the New Jerusalem. So the building of the temple and the restoration of Jerusalem are through King Yeshua, not by the hands of men. And that's why the efforts of certain people in the land to rebuild yet another physical temple of stone are really futile. And it's dangerous for believers in Yeshua to participate in those actions because it ignores history, the scriptures, and it ignores the fulfillment of Yeshua. Yeshua, our King and our High Priest, did it all. And to support a reign, a country, or a priesthood that ignores him and ignores his position is pure error. So, if you do choose to commemorate the days of Purim, make sure that you are already observing the actual appointed times in the Torah and recognizing Yeshua's fulfillment of those times. And may your focus always be on Yeshua and the eternal work of deliverance that he accomplished through his blood. See, he was a king, but he wasn't honored, and he didn't live in palaces or have great wealth like Esther and Mordecai. Instead, he gave up his life so we can live, not in Persia or Babylon, but in his covenant land and his eternal kingdom. Shalom.